All right. Well, this has been, I'm almost speechless as to how much good content we've seen so far today. I'm just kind of amazed by it. So what I want to do right now is I just want to introduce the panel very quickly. I mean, Shannon Vallor, of course, is our keynote speaker, and Mathieu Guillermin is here from France, and he's the head of the NHNAI project, and Susan is here from Santa Clara University, where she is our professor who does a lot of technology ethics work. Thank you. And I just wanted to start then with kind of a first question, and we'll start with you, Susan. If you can kind of say, over the course of the day, what have you heard that stuck with you?
I will try and keep this brief, although I will say I just found this like a really rich discussion, and I found myself furiously taking notes, so I tried to synthesize and distill some points. So starting at the beginning of the day with you and Mathieu, just sort of discussing the project that's taken place over these 4 years. So there's a couple of points that stood out to me from that, which is one of them, this idea of like, is it clear what it means to be human and how that related to this idea of a new humanism? Because I think that's a really important question and one that we keep running up against now as we're confronting technologies that kind of force us to re-examine that. Another was this project involved a lot of time, but also just it's a global project. There are so many different stakeholders involved, so many different countries and diverse viewpoints. And then this idea that there really wasn't that many divergences in the viewpoints you were seeing, but maybe just different points of emphasis, right? So similar concerns, but just being presented in different ways and highlighted in different ways. And then lastly, the idea of like maybe how we frame a problem or question is actually already quite revealing of some of the assumptions that we're making and bringing to the table before we even get started. And then we went into Shannon's talk, and I just have to say, I'm just always in awe of how eloquent you are when you present things. But I really love the way this deflationary view was articulated, because I really feel this, and even in my the views that my students express sometimes. You know, we'll talk about Chinese room, the thought experiment from Searle, and sometimes we're like, well, aren't we just manipulating symbols? And it's really that idea that humans aren't doing anything more beyond what AI or LLMs are doing. And so then that, when we get to this idea of this project of of decoding, having to resist this urge of once we maybe discard one view that doesn't work for us or it isn't fitting us right now, immediately latching onto or trying to replace it with something else and actually just allowing ourselves to sit with some of that uncertainty. And then, so then we had another panel after that with multiple speakers. So I think Greg had raised this idea of the way he was approaching dignity was from the lack of it or the ways in which it had been denied to him and how that impacts an individual. So when you confront these assaults on dignity, how you start to believe that about yourself, that you are worthless or that you're lacking that dignity. And if you're not able to change the conditions, well, then maybe you're able to change something about yourself, right, as he's reclaiming that then. And Arena had raised this point about dignity and having to be able to locate it through the cracks, she said. And it reminded me of this paper by Christy Dotson, Concrete Flowers. So I had this visual when she said that of, right, the rose that's kind of coming up through the concrete, which I think brings a little bit of optimism, right? I mean, it's said in this way where, yes, you're facing maybe really oppressive and unjust context, but where there's this resilience to humanity where they find a way through the cracks to reclaim some humanity and dignity. And Jane had discussed the idea of just being or like allowing ourselves and allowing other people to sort of exist in that fullness. And I really liked the way that was phrased in terms of just allowing ourselves to be, because I think, and going back to Shannon's talk, there's always so much of the optimization, the pressure, the production, doing more, instead of just actually allowing ourselves to exist and appreciate ourselves and one another. And then getting to the talk about organizations and what they could be doing. So, you know, I think we see these examples where organizations are doing responsible AI, and we see that it's possible to be done, but also I think Tracy raised a very good point, which is that it's not required. We don't have laws that actually enforce those regulations that make this happen. So you still have this self-selecting problem. And then that's where you start running into these tensions of, well, there's this arms race, there's always a rush to sort of deploy products, and that goes against what we might think of as the best practices for responsible AI, where it's really doing things at the start by design, slowing down when we need to slow down. So you're trying to sort of wrestle between these. And a point that came up, I think, a few times was the sort of participation, nothing about us without us. So if you really do want to do responsible AI and do it right, that requires sort of going beyond just who's already on the team and who's involved, but actually trying to include other voices and expand that idea of participation. And then in the last talk we saw from Beth, it was at the beginning of her talk, but she had mentioned this, there was already work being done to show that this levy was going to fail. And then they decided not to fix it because when they ran their cost-benefit analysis, determined that it wasn't worth it. And I was thinking of the way Kant, and I think this is important in this conversation on dignity, because I think that Kantian idea of dignity is kind of what was led to the sort of Declaration of Human Rights, and it's a concept that was really influential. But he described it as being non-fungible, like above all price. And that seemed like a clear example to me where we did put a dollar sign on dignity, we did put a dollar sign on humanity, and at the end of that calculation decided it's not worth fixing this levy that we know is going to fail, and we know what the cost is, and then proceeded that way anyways. And so in Beth talking about her work, you know, there's technologies in the very broad sense. And this is, I think, how I'll end all this, so I swear this was my best to distill everything. I know I'm rambling now, but first, there was a point of now when we talk about AI, it usually becomes a conversation about LLMs, because that's the new thing in the hype cycle, right? And I think before this, it was when we're talking about AI, what people are really thinking about is machine learning. But AI is actually more than even machine learning, right? AI is also really just basic and simple. Us coming up with the list of rules, we give it the inputs and then outputs. We've been doing AI for a very long time, and there's also a way of thinking about algorithms that are just not even digital. We use algorithms as people to make decisions, and it has nothing to do with like digital technologies. And so I think that we'll revisit maybe this issue, but as we're thinking about this, yes, AI is what maybe brought us all here together, but I wouldn't want to restrict this conversation or the insights we have just to AI either as LLMs or machine learning or even just digital technologies, but really much broader than that, because I think that's just how important the issue is. Okay, so that's my summary of the day.
That's fantastic. I think you did a great job because there was so much that was said. It was really hard to condense it even to what you just said. Mathieu?
Okay, hope. Oh, fantastic. I'm not cursed. You uncursed me. Wonderful job. Yeah, no, I agree with Brian. It was a wonderful summary, and I would have been totally unable to summarize that way. So maybe I will try to insist on some points that are in my radar as very important, even if it won't be as faithful to what you did. But for instance, something that is really key to me is managing to return, and we did that all the day, and especially during the last session, to what's happening is a political question. It's inherently political, and we have to address it that way and to commit and engage that way. And to do that, if I try to weave a bit around that idea, for instance, what Shannon put really clear about the ideology behind AI, that it's not the existential risk with strong AI or whatever, it's science fiction. It's not damaging per se. What is damaging is the ideology that is behind, and that we could rephrase as a kind of, you'll tell me if it's okay, but a kind of impoverished outcomeism. meaning that you look only and you claim that what is important is the entry and it's the modeling idea. You map entries on inputs on outputs. And when you do that, for instance, I'm not sure we won't have some people claiming that. Let's make large language model pass psychology exams, and if they give the good answers, then let them operate officially, saying it's the only thing that counts. And this is very dangerous because it's an undermining of our encountering with life and with the other at broad. And it's really important that but it's also a political and cultural fight, but we preserve our ability and we reinforce our abilities to look at what happens between inputs and outputs, to be able to, not to say that it's always important that someone has lived something, but sometimes we want to be able to value, or we need to win, to earn that right, to value that. And I give you a few examples. So first, of course, I don't elaborate on why I'm pretty convinced, but we would need more time. It's totally meaningless to talk about AI living something. So just to illustrate that, there is no artificial decision-making for me. Either there is decision-making or there is a clockwork working. But you can't have both. And so this being said, it's important that we always say when something has been done by a clockwork or when it's done by a human, for us to be able to judge based on that also. And in some case, you don't want anybody leaving anything, because if it's about going to Chernobyl and getting the radioactive parts, you're okay with a robot. But if it's about, I don't know, a drawing or a picture, an artistic picture, people, I saw articles attacking that natural reaction we all have about saying, okay, it's very nice. And you tell people it's made by an AI. And then you say, oh, no, not that nice. And we try to push you into guilt, saying your lack of objectivity. Because when you were not knowing that it was an AI, you love that. And no, just because you know it's not an AI, you don't love that anymore. And this is very problematic. We really need to defend that. And so the drawing, but it's obvious in some simple case. Your children come with drawings, and it's wonderful. It's really nice, but it's one sentence in a generative AI system. Versus the children come with paintings, paints all on his face. He brings something that is like, oh, nice. It's a dog. No, it's a cow. Oh, yes, it's a cow. You see, the output in itself is not nice, but it's wonderful anyway. And the value it has, everything lies in the process. In the children, if there are several, they lived something that has some values. And I really think that about dignity, I'll talk about dignity when it comes to digital technologies that manage to, with the progress, we manage to get results by clockworks, to summarize, that it was not possible before. And that's results that normally you need someone living something to get. And it's really important that because, okay, our ability to value the presence of life in someone else and to connect to that, I think it's already eroded for many, many reasons. But now the attack is even stronger because we could start trying to tell people the artificial companion, you need to behave as if it was a human, or to consider it's human because you don't have to look inside. It's irrelevant. No, it's a huge attack against everything we are. And so we really need to develop our intuitions about what is living or not, and maybe change them a bit sometimes, but not just because of outcomes, not just because you have a good results. So we know how to judge. You're living, all of you are living, and I'm pleased to connect with you because of that, and it's not the same with a machine, and we need to fight and to defend that a lot. And this leads me to my last point, at least for now, because if not, I will be too long. But it's about, I heard, can we, or that tension between my dignity and the dignity of others. And I think it's fairly impossible to foster your dignity without fostering the one of others. It's going together. And it's something I like with a French philosopher called Michel Henry, who presents the life and so the barbarians, what they do when they torture someone, it's they push someone else to will not have a lived experience, you see? And he said, the very moment you enter into pushing someone, renouncing his own lived experience, you somehow mutilate yours. And you can't be fully human. And I think it's the same with dignity. You can't have yours at the expense of the one of the others. If not, you won't manage. And that's really something you need. It's not theoretical. It's something, if we want to have dignity, we need to be able to, and to reinforce our ability to feel that interconnection or interweavedness between dignity at large. So, stop.
Wonderful. That's a whole ton more insights there, and they're different than what Susan said. I mean, this is really fascinating. Shannon.
Yeah, I'm going to try and tie these points together because they, both of the previous speakers, I think, are finding things that resonated with me as well today. So I was really glad, Susan, that you talked about Kant and this notion of the non-fungibility of the human person, and the fact that the human person has a kind of worth that is unconditional and unquantifiable. So the worth of a human cannot be placed on a scale where some humans then are higher on the scale and lower on the scale than others. And of course, we live in a world of social systems that do exactly that kind of ranking, right? That ranking of worth. We see it happen to our children in school. We see it happen to us at work. Some of you will have worked for companies that do stack ranking, where you literally just line the people up and each person has to be above or below the person before them in worth. And the notion of human dignity, right, is that all of this is in fact a violation of our responsibility to recognize one another's worth. And that was something that I think came up very strongly in the panel following my keynote, where we had these powerful testimonies of the importance of being seen, and being seen in such a way that one is recognized for their unconditional worth, as opposed to evaluated according to some set of criteria that allows us to decide how much worth you have. And so this notion of being recognized for the fullness of our worth in a way that's not fungible, that's not quantifiable, that's not rankable, is so fundamental, I think, to the concept of dignity. And I think it is part of the notion of dignity that resonates across cultures and resonates across individuals. And it made me think of a philosopher that I spoke about briefly in the opening of my most recent book, and that's another French philosopher, Emmanuel Levinas, who wrote In Totality and Infinity about what he calls the gaze of the other. And he capitalizes always other to indicate that this is a non-fungible, right? The capitalization there is meant to recognize that the other is not just a thing among, not just one among many, but singular in its worth. And he talks about how when I find myself exposed to the gaze of the other, the look of the other, and you have to think about that moment you will have had at some point in your life, right, where someone is looking at you and the eyes are pulling you almost in a way that burns, not necessarily in a bad way, but that you can't look away. You're somehow held by that gaze. And he talks about this as the gaze which pulls me into responsibility. and is also the foundation of the call to justice, this moment where I'm pulled into responsibility for the other simply by recognizing their presence. But he also says, and this is, I think, related to this tension that we were talking about and what, Mathieu, you were just talking about this notion of my own dignity not being able to be enjoyed without also recognizing the dignity of others. Levinas says, in the eyes that look at me, the eyes of the other, shines the whole of humanity. So his claim is that when I am held by that wordless gaze that pulls me into this sense of I am responsible to this person, I'm also aware of that person as part of the human family, and they carry, in some sense, the moral weight of the human family, and that's partly what's pulling me. But I wanted to reflect on what Mathieu just said, that this is, our failure to do this is not an outgrowth of AI, not even an outgrowth of digital technology, something that is perhaps being exacerbated by these technologies, but something that's much older. And I was struck when I was writing my book by the relevance of what he's saying, but also when he said it, because it was in 1961 when he wrote this, and when he said, quote, "We live in a time where no being looks at the face of the other." So even in 1961, Levinas was aware that something about modernity had kind of detached us from our ability to recognize one another in our dignity, which means that we're also failing to see the whole of humanity in one another. So I was just left with this question, right? How do we relearn to see that? What are the experiences that allow us to relearn that capacity, which we've been losing for some time? And what are the rituals, what are the experiences, what are the kind of social institutions that support that experience, that learning? So that's one theme that has just been with me all day long. Another is the importance of recognizing, and Mathieu, you gestured to this as well, the kind of political nature of our situation and the ideology that's driving it. And the fact that we have to be willing to approach it as a political challenge, and one that good intentions are not going to be sufficient to address. So during the panel discussion of organizational responsibility, I was really struck by the fact that all of the individuals on the panel have been part of organizations that, to some extent or another, had good intentions or good processes, but nevertheless were failing to live up to those responsibilities in some way. And I think we have to be honest about the fact that we live in a world where the politics and the economics of our world have created strong disincentives to responsibility. I think it was Daniel who was talking about, the importance of responsibility not resting in a CEO alone, but being diffused throughout an entire organization, which is absolutely true and absolutely makes sense. And yet, as someone who's seen how this often plays out, given the incentives that corporations are under, and the incentives, as Tracy said, purely to advance the interests of their investors and shareholders, what often happens in practice is you just scapegoat someone lower on the chain of command, lower in the power hierarchy. They get hung out to dry for a decision that hurts somebody, even though if you go back and look at it, you will almost invariably find that that person was under overwhelming internal pressure and incentives to make that decision, and pressure from above, right? And that person would often have been placed in a position where to not make that decision, they would have lost everything, right? Now, sometimes you have to be the moral hero and walk away and not do the bad thing that you know is going to hurt people, even if your boss demands it. But we can't allow corporations to scapegoat individuals when the power to create the right incentives ultimately rests at a higher level. But the same problem recurs at the political level because we've allowed corporations to be governed by these incentives alone. And in fact, we've exposed them to great risk if they don't follow those incentives. So corporations can be sued for acting in ways that are not in the interest of their shareholders, but are in the public interest, right? So we as voters, we as citizens, also carry a responsibility here. And so I think that brings it back to politics. We have a world that we have allowed to be designed to reward inhumane behavior by corporations and by powerful individuals, and for those individuals and organizations to escape meaningful accountability. And until we gain the political courage again to demand the sorts of reforms that in the late 20th century we were beginning to make, but have backed away from, until we can get back to that political courage, I think we will be cleaning up the messes after the fact rather than building the better world that we deserve. And the final thought I will share has to do with the fact that the many truly beneficial applications of AI that were discussed today, from the use of AI to contain fusion fields, or the use of AI to map and predict floods. These are things that I've long championed. I think AI, broadly speaking, is a fantastically powerful and beneficial technology. But because of the incentives we've allowed to dominate the industry, and because of now the fact that a version of AI, generative AI, has risen as very possibly the most harmful AI technology and the least net benefit compared to these others, right? Fusion, the algorithm that contains the energy in a fusion reactor is not a large language model. It's not generative AI, right? And the same goes for the algorithms that are mapping these floods, right? So we have beneficial AI algorithms that carried some risks, but then we have tremendously risky technologies of AI now that are dominating the commercial market. But there's a really interesting thing, but scary thing that's happening, which is there's also a huge backlash against AI that's coming from that. And I talk to people every day online and in person who've decided that AI is the devil. And they're not making careful distinctions about harmful forms of AI versus beneficial forms of AI, or AI that's being developed by scientific researchers for the public interest versus AI that's being developed by large commercial companies for global profit, right? So we're at risk, and Tracy gestured to this, of actually, I think, damaging the long-term potential of AI as a technology for human benefit. And these companies, I think, are damaging their own future viability potentially by carrying on in this way, which is very beneficial to them in the short term, or at least they perceive it to be so. But I think in the long term is turning people against AI as a broad class of technologies, which is not the outcome I think that we should want. So even if we are, AI boosters, I think we should be demanding the kinds of change to the incentives that are driving the tech ecosystem. Because if we can't get people to believe that technological advancements are potentially good for them and good for society, then we've really failed in understanding what technology is for. So that's where I'll leave that.
That's fantastic.
Brian, let me get the audience into this just a little bit, because you've been listening all day, and most of you have been here all day, listening to so many people talk about so many aspects of AI and trying to identify humanity and human dignity. What were your motivations for coming today. And as you heard the terms, what resonated with me most, it's about process. You heard earlier about hope. What did you learn today that might have resonated for you? And you can just raise your hand and I'm going to walk over to you and give you the mic.
Thank you. For a long time now, I've been possessed with this sense that the Western world, at least, and probably the whole world to some degree, is in an epistemological crisis, and that this crisis really just took off during the Enlightenment. I am concerned about AI in very many practical ways. I'm a teacher, writer, I'm a writer, visual artist, and all that Gen AI stuff for that is very, very threatening. But I think one of the things that has been very confirming to me from Dr. Vallor's talk the other day and this wonderful day is that we really are actually talking about what I would say are not only epistemological but metaphysical issues. That underneath all of this, there's a way in which human beings understand themselves and the universe and the way we know. So to me, there's a great relief in knowing that my silly sense of the existential AI threat is not real. And yet this older monster of what I call exclusive rationalism, not rationalism itself, which I am totally for, but exclusive rationalism that pushes everything else away. It's like I'm like, oh, there's an alien, like Dr. Rocket, there's an alien mind coming. No, it's the same old dragon from a long time ago. And that's part of what I'm very, very appreciative of learning, or having confirmed, I should say, by this. And thanks to everyone.
So much. Anyone else? Oh, good. Motivations and what's resonated.
Sure. I'm Caitlin Krause. The reason I came, Julia Scott invited me. Some of you might know her. I teach at Stanford in the wellness department, which is under the Department of Medicine. And I'm also a writer, storyteller, have my own company. And I'd been developing in virtual reality for the past 20 years, a programming background. And my spidey sense has just been feeling in the past 5 years, after also a decade in middle school and high school teaching, that the phrase that came up at the beginning of the year was moral beauty. Like, where is there beauty? And beauty that is in those morally guided ethical actions that create a human spirit of dignity and love. And I see the human-to-human interactions as being mediated by technology, and right now a need for people to come together in these types of dialogues, to not just puzzle it out and try to come to a solution, but try to have speed bumps for self-reflection and going inward. So I came here to meet other people on that path and share dialogues, because I think we need this sense of hope coupled with agency. So I'm really grateful for all the talks. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know another hand was up over here. I know Brian has other questions for the panelists, but this is to me quite important to get their take on this.
Thank you for wonderful presentations. I'm Bill O'Neill at the Markkula Center here. We've spoken of dignity as irreducible, unconditional worth, but that also carries with it, doesn't it, a sense of the distinctiveness and the irreplaceability of persons, a kind of concrete universality. That's lost largely in any utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. And I wonder, to what degree is it also lost, or potentially lost, in the large language models of AI? Not only the unconditional worth, but specifically the distinctiveness and the irreplaceability of persons. Thank you.
That was a question. Let's get our panelists.
I can
please
briefly address that. I have a colleague who's working on this specifically because the nature of large language models is essentially to merge and aggregate all individual lived expressions into one giant mathematical structure, and then to generate continually the outputs from that same mathematical structure. So there's a homogeneity that that gets churned out from these models. And because the data sets are relatively similar, although not identical, the AI products from different companies also are not that dissimilar from one another in the style that they articulate. So this notion of the uniqueness and non-fungibility of each individual, which I think we heard in that earlier panel about, I want to be seen and valued in my person in a way that connects to my story that is unlike anyone else's, not better or worse. Not that I want to be compared with others, but precisely the opposite, that I want to be valued without having to be compared with another. And I do think this issue that large language models, particularly that are produced for social purposes as companions, right? Not only do they have these acute dangers that Tracy spoke about, but even if they were safer to interact with, which they're not, right? I would not be interacting with a unique individual with a unique history and lived experience. I'm interacting with the same mathematical structure that everyone else using this bot is. And even if I prompt it to behave in a different way than my neighbor prompts it to behave, it's ultimately the same structure that's speaking to me.
Yeah. On that, maybe we can add also, or it's telling it another way, but because there is that notion more in medicine, but personalized medicine thanks to algorithms. But the only personalization you get with that, it's not individuation in any interesting biological or philosophical sense. It's just because if the computational structure is big enough, you can attribute a number to anyone. And so anyone will be tagged by a specific number and will be treated accordingly, depending on the data that are attached to that number. I'm simplifying, and this is individuation in a kind of mathematical sense, but that is very, very different from the one that really matters if we protect our space to thinking what matters. That is being recognized. I love Levinas with that idea that we, in the experience of the face of the other, I recognize him or her, and he or she recognizes me. And that sense of individual or personalization, there is not. And so it's a huge fraud, probably, to use the term personalization. And maybe on the first problem with, I agree that AI is not the problem, the beginning of the problem. And I maybe just want to add something, because it's not rationalism, and I don't know exactly what exclusive rationalism mean. But for me, I would point the problem towards the myth, because it's a myth, of pure inquiry. And thinking that you have a strong demarcation between knowledge, and I agree that comes with, but it comes with Plato also. So, and the debate between Plato and within Aristotle, you have both. You have phronesis and philosophy, and you have truth with absolute certainty, or do your opinion the best you can. And this is along all the whole of our philosophical and cultural tradition, and we have that problem that comes out explicitly with Descartes, for instance. Pure absolute certainty through neutrality. You don't choose, and when you don't choose, you have knowledge, and this is rationality. And I would connect what you said with that idea, because if you do that, then you draw a demarcation between knowledge and belief, and freedom and responsibility, they're on the side of choosing, of beliefs. And this is very wrong, I think. There is no knowledge without practical commitment, hidden somewhere at least. And I would prefer they're on the open to check they're okay, but ultimately it's informal checking. It's checking with the guts, with intuitions, which is not the same that doing everything you want. But this has very, very concrete impacts on AI ethics, if I may add, because when we talk about tech ethics, we were discussing that during the lunch, there is a bit that idea that it's possible to think the problem with an objective part that is about facts, and money, economics. They want to push the money part in the facts, and then you have the part that add on that is about ethics. And as if not all what we're doing when we produce something, when we give a service, it's not about acting. And then if it's about acting, it's about choosing. And it means that it's ethical or a practical question about what should I do from the very basic. And there is no meaning to add ethics to the top afterward, because the practicality of everything we're doing is already there. But of course, there is the legitimate, ethically speaking, goal to make money enough to make your employees leave and to get a salary for you, to invest and things like this. But then there is also the problem of doing money while protecting that data privacy or mind privacy or whatever. But all this comes at the same time in parallel. And it's very important that we correct a bit our philosophical and cultural background on this to be able to see that. And ethics is here everywhere. It's not something that we add to the top or accepting to reduce it to something you add afterward and that will lead to break, slow down. It's mutilating so much what ethics means, for me at least. It's really, for me, it's just from the start we should wonder about what is the good thing to do now, and in all the dimensions. And then maybe we will see tensions between dimensions, and we have to make them explicit and recognized by everybody. And then it can become a global or globally discussed political problem, collectively discussed political problem. So sorry for the
One more question over here.
Oh, you're good.
Anybody else? Yes. You get one more. Oh no. Okay. Let me ask you one other question, because it's been getting to me this for a long time. What agency do we have, each of us in here as individuals, to somehow navigate whatever AI is within our lives? Like, how are there, reducing it to a simple thought about what behaviors can I have? What actions can I have? What types of influence might I have in whatever I do, whether it's at work or in my own family? I have young kids. I have grandkids now. Like, what's my agency to help them understand a future of humanity as it relates to artificial intelligence?
More than you think, and more than everyone thinks. And that's because the narrative for 20 years or longer, but certainly accelerating the last 20 years, the narrative has been to convince you that whatever the current shape of technology is, that's an inevitability. And that all you can do is adapt to whatever that shape imposes upon you. So the most important thing is to reject that narrative outright, to see how cynical and false it is. To Matthew's point just now, everything that has led us to this moment was a result of human choices. And human responses to those choices. And one of the strongest strategies of the kind of Silicon Valley ideology has been to convince you to not push back, to convince you to accept and adapt to whatever shape of technology is dropped on your life and your children's lives, right? So the first thing is to recognize we've been lulled by a certain narrative of technological determinism or technological inevitability into passivity, into a sense that we must just await whatever AI brings. So if we can just recognize the falsehood of that, we're already claiming back more agency. And then in concrete ways, things like, I mean, you all came here. That's your agency right here. You all leave here knowing things about AI and human dignity that you didn't before, right? All of us who are spending our time learning what's going on, becoming aware of the risks and the harms, becoming more aware of the strengths and limitations of the technology. Of course, there's a limit to what any one of us can do, but all of us have agency that we're already exercising, or else we wouldn't be in this room together. And that agency spreads to other people. So what I love is finding people who are also having these same conversations with their kids, with their neighbors, with their coworkers, and sharing what they know back and forth. So there is tremendous power in our ability to learn and to share deeper understandings of the world we're in. That has always been true. And it's one of the ways that we, what was the analogy that someone else used a moment ago for how humans manage to free ourselves from oppressive systems? It was so much better than the one I've been using lately. But the point is that humans have a long history of getting trapped in oppressive systems, but we're also pretty good over the long term at chewing our way out of them. Chewing our way out of monarchy, chewing our way out of slavery, chewing our way out of disenfranchisement. And doing that together, not as individual heroes, but as people who begin to build a cultural force that acts against those oppressive structures. So each of us can do a little bit of that, and jointly together, at one point, it becomes enough.
And prolonging exactly I hope, your thought. I guess today, with AI, we have a tremendous opportunity at the same time to discuss openly in society topics that usually we talk among philosophers only. And I think this is wonderful, because machines start being able to do complex stuff that normally are associated to autonomous living beings. You start wondering about what it means for everybody. And that's great. Students, unfortunately, I would say, now that they can have their assignments done with AI or other children, you can discuss with them why they would do it. Before, it was an under-the-mat question. Now it's an exploding, obvious question for everybody. And I think we should start to discuss that first with all our students before doing anything else. And then maybe they would, as I told you, but I will repeat for the other, I tell my students, of course, I know that it's not enough, but before using AI to do what I ask you to do, reflect upon why I ask you to do that assignment. And if you can explain to me why the assignment is useless, then it's okay. You'll have a good mark and you won't do it. But then we will reflect on why it's useless, because because I'm a crappy teacher, or because it's because of the economic system and social system around us that makes that you only need a diploma, but you don't need the content or something like this. But do you really want to live in a world like this? You see, all those topics, they're on the table now. That's wonderful. And I think one of the key topics that is on the table now, and it's at last, it's what it means to educate. What is the purpose of education? Is it because if it's just for people to have a function in society, then we fall back into impoverished outcomeism or something like this, where a machine may be able to play the same function in a certain point of view. So, of course, it's about being able to play a role in society. But maybe more fundamentally, at least that's my conviction that I share, and it's also an answer, training as much as we can from the very youngest stages, try to trigger into children and after into students the quest for what it means to be a good person, what it means for me to be a good person. But without saying this is that or this or that, but starting to create that quest and then feeding it with example of friendly behavior, love, of values that we uphold because we believe in them, but because we live them that way and we share that. And then it will also mean being a good person as a citizen, as something else, as a lawyer, as a journalist. And then we will accompany them by giving them some skills and some content, but because they want to be a good person. So you see, at refocusing, I don't know. But I think that's why I'm always a bit disturbed with the saying the modernity, we lack a turn at that moment. I think we have to accomplish the modernity movement that was about becoming genuine persons. Also, there was that. And so triggering that quest and feeding it, because you realize that being a good person, it's not applying codes, it's not applying rules. And I agree with that problem of modernity. But it's about a way of being that you need to develop. This is something we need to do, and we have the opportunity to do today.
I'm going to turn this around a little bit and ask Susan and Brian. This is the digital future. What do I tell them? What is the world for my 4-month-old granddaughter going to be as it relates to the impact of artificial intelligence? I know that's a very broad question, but we've talked about today how there are different views of where we are now and where we're going. We just talked about, let's not lose sight of the benefits of AI because of the harms. We also heard about the incredible harms that maybe children are, of course, are experiencing.
So I think as a philosopher and an ethicist, sometimes I find myself focusing on the negatives or maybe pessimistic views, but I want to be maybe optimistic here. And I also think that what both Shannon and Matthew were just saying, we're hitting on the 2 points that do have me feeling optimistic about the future. As Shannon was saying, we do have agency, and we actually have a lot more than we think. And I think that really comes back to this question of, like, what sort of treatment are we willing to accept? If we really believe that we all have dignity and that that's of a certain kind of worth, right, above all price, well, then we need to really start speaking up for ourselves, right, and feeling empowered. And if we're not being invited to do so, then taking that and maybe doing it a little more aggressively. And the optimist angle that I get from Matthew's response is the way in which AI is a catalyst for thinking about these big questions. And those are the ones that I get really excited about. And it's just unavoidable when, with AI and with technology and how quickly it's developing. Sorry, I'm thinking of The Simpsons and Sideshow Bob, and like there's this one scene, and every time he takes a step, he goes on a rake, and it just like comes back up and smacks him in the face. And I feel like technology is a lot of that, where we have to keep encountering ourselves, running into ourselves. And Schelling's Spheerstraat talks about hot and cold morality, and you can almost like think of it as an iceberg. When we do ethics, we're really focused on the stuff that's above water, the part that we can see. And he describes this activity he does with his students, and I've done it with mine in the classroom, of, okay, tell me what you think are the moral and social norms in the classroom. And they'll hand me back an index card with a few of these listed out, and all the things that they list are the ones that are like, oh, cool, so showing up on time, not talking when someone else is talking, you know, paying attention and not being distracted. I was like, I guarantee every single one of you in this classroom has violated one of these things that you take to be the kind of key moral and social norms. And it's because those are the visible ones. They're the ones that are constantly being violated or breached, that they're at the front of our, you know, forefront of our consciousness. The ones, you know, no one has to be told, and no one thinks like, well, you all showed up to class wearing clothes today, you know? But obviously that's a norm that's at play, and that's when you start getting at, you know, what's underneath water, what's at the bottom of the iceberg. And I think what we're seeing with AI now, and maybe this is, you know, what has me optimistic, is it's forcing us to ask these questions of, yeah, like fairness and bias and discrimination. And as we see algorithms take over what was already, I guess, a human sort of algorithm, maybe in hiring or deciding who gets a promotion or who gets fired, or there was lots of focus on Compass and the recidivism algorithm, right? But this was just AI doing what was already kind of a human process. There was already humans basically treating people like a checklist, right? And so what I love is when I see my students have things to say about, they're like, oh, this is outrageous. And I was like, okay, well, let me know when you're ready for the conversation about how this was already a process that they just automated. So we were already doing this as humans. And so we now have to revisit, but I love that it ignites that kind of passion to see that there's lots of institutions, and you know, the easy pickings, I guess, for AI is the things that were already very much like an algorithm, that it just now just had to be automated. But it gets us to care about these things in a wide variety of institutions. And so I think we're going to keep asking these questions about dignity. And so it's going to be hard. I don't think there's any way around that. But I think I am optimistic that we're going to have to do that work. And it's about time we do. And we figure out what it is that we want as humanity, right? And that's a deceptively, I think, it sounds like a simple question, but I think it's actually one of the most difficult, is figuring out what we actually want for ourselves before we can figure out how we can build this technology in a better way and in a way that really suits us.
Yeah, what comes to my mind is a phrase from Shannon's earlier book, Technology and the Virtues, where she uses the phrase, we're living in a time of acute technosocial opacity. And I was talking to Daniel Lim earlier, saying, I know you're envisioning the future. Have you noticed the horizon's getting shorter? And he said, absolutely, yes. We can't predict. They don't even try to see past 3 years anymore. They in the past, they felt like they could see farther than that, but now it's like 3 years, absolute maximum, much more likely less than that. And so this kind of shortened horizon, I think, it puts us in the state of extreme uncertainty. And when people are uncertain, they start grasping at straws of certainty. And that grasping at straws, I think, is making itself known in the culture and in politics all over the world, with people trying to find something solid that they can hold on to, whether it is a strong political leader or whether it is a strong tradition of some sort or other sorts of something that feels solid, because we're in this situation where, think of it as maybe society is liquefying or something like that. We're going through some sort of phase change, and so you need to grab something before you slip away. But I think that I want to reiterate what Susan was just saying and what Mathieu was saying and what Shannon was saying, which is that this is also a chance to rediscover what really matters. And connecting to Bill's question earlier, a lot of, and also what Shannon was saying earlier, this idea that the AI decomposes us into information, right? And the decomposed human gets fed into the LLM, and then out comes something which is an abstracted form of humanity. What do we call something when it decomposes? Only dead things decompose. And so this is the question of how do we, instead of letting ourselves be killed, metaphorically, and fed into a large language model, which then creates this simulacrum of humanity behind it, how do we reclaim ourselves and say, no, there's actually a real living human being here? And I think the way we do that, once again, is to assert agency. It's to assert all these more relational forms of knowledge, the idea of Ubuntu that you brought up earlier, Mathieu, the idea that we don't raise ourselves up by pushing others down. We raise ourselves up by lifting everyone up with us. This reminds me of a lot of things, but I think I'll just, since I know we're running out of time, I'll just wrap up with a quote from Wendell Berry. Wendell Berry was speaking once, and someone asked him, what should we do for the future? And he said, the only thing we can do for the future is to do the right thing now. And I thought that was just he's right. There's no way around it.
Thank you, Brian and Susan and Mathieu and Shannon. The only thing I'll mention at the very end here is as I think as you walk out of here today, Irina, yes.
By the machine learning flood researcher, because I love the idea of raising all the questions, and that's fantastic. But she said what we need is a decision chain with a theory of change. So I think it's too easy for philosophers to talk about, and ethicists to talk about, we're just here to raise the questions. I think this is urgent enough, and not that you guys have said that, but I think she, was somebody in the field saying there's this injustice and inhumanity, this is how it's playing out, I'm researching it, and I want to figure out how to change it. So I would say the critics are the optimists. The critics are the ones who are saying we can do better, let's figure out what the better version is and go and do it. So it sounded, I wrote it down, decision chain with a theory of change. Again, it might not work out, and these are systemic things and they're very difficult, but I think we really need to push hard that way.
Thank you, Irina. Yeah, and I'll just finish up by saying that, as you walk out of here today, maybe look at somebody else and see the other. We heard that today, and then be able to see yourself when you look in the mirror the next time, playing off of really the AI mirror and thinking through that is reflecting us. Humanity has so much that we can give to each other, and there's so much we can take away from each other. And I just hope that today allows us to think and understand that we do have agency. And when you look in that mirror, understand the agency that you have. And let's move forward together and make this world a better place. So thank you very much, everybody, for being here today.